The story begins with Vicar van Baskerville, a man who had served the Baskerville family as a devoted hound, facing execution by guillotine. He had been condemned under baseless accusations of colluding with the Demon Clan. As he confronted his impending death, Vicar swore that should he be granted another life, he would never again live bound as a hound. Subsequently, he awoke disoriented and bewildered within an infant's cradle. He initially wondered if he might be in some layer of the underworld, as his immediate surroundings were loud with sound and his body felt heavy and unfamiliar. It soon became clear Vicar was presently situated in a nursery, occupied by many other infants, all of whom were crying. Meanwhile, the head of the Baskerville lineage, Hugo La Baskerville, was conducting an inspection of the children's cradles. He moved about the chamber, noticing the wailing babies but dismissing them as insignificant, even referring to them as refuse. However, upon approaching Vicar, he observed that this particular infant was quieter than the others. Hugo then issued the command for Vicar's relocation to the Cradle of Swords, and his attendant complied immediately without question. As Vicar lay in the cradle, he directed a gaze of pure animosity upwards towards Hugo. He knew, with certainty, that Hugo was the primary individual responsible for his unfounded charges and subsequent demise. Vicar realized he had been reverted to his infancy and that he had lived his previous existence as an operative for the Baskerville household. Vicar had been born into humble origins and had received his upbringing and training in a difficult environment. He had been molded into a faithful hound, willing to perform any unsavory task required to elevate the Baskerville family to preeminence among the 7 noble houses. Vicar had maintained his loyalty to the family and to Hugo because he had yearned for recognition, but in the end, his devotion had been met with a death sentence. The reason for his execution was straightforward: he possessed dangerous knowledge. Vicar vowed once more that he would never relive that existence and that he would pursue vengeance. Nevertheless, trapped in his infant form, he understood his current powerlessness. Being moved to the Cradle of Swords represented a valuable chance for Vicar to enhance his strength. Children born into the Baskerville family were compelled to undergo a specific ordeal called the Cradle of Swords. They were placed within a labyrinth composed of blades, and after navigating it, they had to reach the Styx River to be assessed for their latent capabilities. The Styx River was a mythical waterway reputed to harden children's bodies like metal. However, its power had a limited capacity, making reaching it quickly paramount. The sole viable path to reach the Styx River first was to proceed directly through the spiral barrier of blades, which was by no means a simple undertaking. As Vicar navigated the Cradle of Swords maze, his thoughts returned repeatedly to his former life. He had been marginalized by his relatives and thus unable to acquire the transformative effect he so desperately needed. But this time, circumstances would be different. He was resolute in his determination to claim the Styx River's blessing exclusively for himself, for as long as he possibly could. As he moved through the labyrinth, he abruptly plunged into the Styx River. The water penetrated deep into his flesh and bones through his cuts, inflicting severe agony. Still, he knew he had to bear it for as long as possible. He could not afford to let this critical opportunity vanish. Beyond the labyrinth, Vicar's attendants were calling out for him to emerge. They were concerned that he would perish if he remained submerged any longer. Yet, Vicar was resolved to hold on for as long as endurance allowed. Meanwhile, Hugo watched with anticipation. He inquired of the Baskerville family's chief attendant, John Barrymore, how much time had passed since Vicar had entered the river. Barrymore replied that approximately 7 minutes had elapsed. Hugo chortled, remarking that Vicar might very well die. The attendants regarded him with apprehension, pleading with the patriarch Hugo to rescue Vicar. Hugo called out to Vicar, instructing him that he could come out of the water now, but Vicar was too engrossed in absorbing the Styx River's power to heed his words. He mused internally that he would not relinquish this chance so readily. He had to draw in as much of its power as possible, right up to the absolute limit. But then, he began to sink as water filled his mouth. Notwithstanding his perilous state, Vicar understood the necessity of persistence. He mentally urged himself, endure, endure, endure. Vicar appeared on the verge of succumbing to the water, but Hugo extracted him with a self-satisfied expression. He remarked on how insatiable Vicar was, even consuming the very liquid of the Styx River. He then observed that Vicar had already developed teeth, which astonished him. Hugo requested Vicar's designation from the head butler, and was informed he was named Vicar van Baskerville. Hugo grinned thinly, stating that a remarkably rapacious offspring had arrived. Vicar, dazed but still aware, resolved that he must utilize this moment to covertly hone his instruments of retribution. He was determined to decapitate his former lord when the opportune moment arrived, and he would accomplish it personally. The Baskerville family would also fade from existence, brought down at his own hands. Vicar van Baskerville had entered the world as the illegitimate offspring of Hugo la Baskerville, a distinguished noble of his era. By the young age of 8 years, it was clear that Vicar exhibited remarkable intellect that greatly exceeded his contemporaries. However, within the Baskerville clan, he was regarded as utterly unremarkable, as he lacked the direct bloodline of the family's main branch heritage. As Vicar matured, he commenced delving into various pursuits, ultimately focusing on the perilous arenas of deadly arts of elimination, clandestine operations, and territorial domination. Upon attaining 2 decades of age, he had already undertaken multiple assignments that demonstrated his considerable prowess. Notwithstanding his successes, Vicar nonetheless perceived himself as insufficient relative to those holding the primary lineage. At the age of 30 years old, the portal to the infernal domain opened, heralding the onset of a dreadful incursion by the infernal factions. Vicar, by then an experienced combatant, rose to protect his domain, participating in conflicts wherein he ruthlessly dispatched monstrous foes. Vicar persevered through the following half-decade of devastation, combating incessantly to safeguard humanity. When the protracted conflict concluded, humanity emerged triumphant. In recognition of his steadfast devotion and valor, Vicar received an award from the sovereign realm. However, the compensation he was granted was not as anticipated. Rather than receiving commendation and accolades for his endeavors, he was confronted with calumnious charges and baseless accusations. These groundless assertions culminated in Vicar's ultimate demise beneath the guillotine's edge. Vicar propped himself upright on his resting place, comprehending his location within a nursery chamber. He grasped the fact that he had effectively assimilated the power of the Styx River. This was a significant accomplishment, and he understood this afforded him a far superior beginning in this new existence than he had previously. Abruptly, the chamber door swung open, and a servant girl stepped inside. The maid appeared astonished and muttered quietly, questioning why the lady of the house had instructed the placement of such an item upon young Master Vicar's sleeping place. Vicar was taken aback by the servant's reference to Madam, as he had not conceived that anyone within the Baskerville clan would bestow a gift upon one of his illegitimate status. After depositing a container upon Vicar's bed, the maid departed. Observing the container as it opened, Vicar was appalled to witness a pair of sanguinary mambas emerging from within. He considered whether the lady of the house had dispatched them for his assassination. Vicar was aware that the title Madam applied to a select few within the Baskerville lineage, and whoever she might be, her motive was likely the elimination of potential rivals. As the venomous serpents hissed menacingly at Vicar, he understood they posed a lethal threat to all the infants in the room. Yet, Vicar seized both mambas with his unassisted hands. Driven by animosity, he resolved that he would dismantle the entire Baskerville clan through his personal actions. The following morning, the denizens of the Baskerville estate were astounded, discovering the infant resting serenely beside the lifeless vipers. Every wet nurse on duty during the previous night was put to death following interrogation. However, the origin of the viper's presence remained a mystery to the family. Only the young vicar, formerly known as a hound, held knowledge of the truth. 8 years hence, Vicar found himself once more within a classroom, attending to his instructor's discourse on the various grades of sword mastery. The instructor proceeded to delineate the hierarchy of swordsmanship proficiency. He explained that an individual unable to infuse their weapon with mana was classified as a sword beginner. The subsequent tier was the sword expert, a stage where one could imbue the blade with a small amount of mana. When the weapon emitted mana in a fluid, aura-like manifestation, it was designated a sword graduate. Finally, the ultimate level, representing the pinnacle of swordsmanship, was the swordmaster, characterized by a solidified aura whose form could be freely altered. Upon hearing the revelation that Sir Hugo, recognized as the most formidable combatant among the Baskervilles, held the esteemed rank of swordmaster, all the pupils present reacted with gasps of surprise and admiration. Vicar, however, was engrossed in his own thoughts, feeling an urgent need to recover the power he had possessed prior to his regression, particularly in anticipation of the upcoming coming-of-age ceremony. The teacher observed Vicar's distracted state and held him in high regard, aware that he had acquired a remarkably resilient physique by remaining submerged in the Styx River for a full 7 minutes. The instructor was convinced that Vicar possessed innate capabilities far exceeding those of his classmates and believed that the patriarch would be immensely pleased to learn of his progress. While Vicar was lost in contemplation about the number of years required to achieve the power to kill Hugo, he failed to notice the hostile glances directed at him by 3 boys known as the triplets. After the lesson concluded, they physically accosted him, shoving him and commencing a barrage of insults. They referred to him contemptuously as a garbage van and mentioned the circulating rumors about his extended immersion in the Styx River and his alleged feat of strangling 2 vipers as a newborn. Vicar instantly recognized the triplets as the very individuals who had assaulted him with knives in his past life when he was attempting to escape following his defamation. They were known collectively as Hugo Le Baskerville's Trident, identified as Hero Le Baskerville, Middleborough Le Baskerville, and Luro Le Baskerville, all 9 years old. The triplets continued their verbal abuse, ordering Vicar to cease his lies and expressing their intense dislike for him. Vicar mused internally that these individuals would become a significant nuisance within the next 10 years and that it might be prudent to establish dominance over them immediately. As Vicar stood facing the triplets, one of them produced a knife and challenged him with a rumor he had heard, that if one remained submerged in the Styx River long enough, their body would become like steel, rendering them immune to injury from blades. The other 2 triplets enthusiastically affirmed the story, while the third commanded one of his brothers to restrain Vicar. The triplet grabbed Vicar from behind, covering his mouth with one hand, and confidently declared that he would consume his own hand if Vicar could endure their test for 3 minutes. Vicar exhibited no fear and even engaged with the cruel game for a moment. The triplets proceeded to attempt to harm him with the knife. 1 minute passed, then 3, then 10, but Vicar remained completely unharmed. The triplets began to grasp that the legend they had heard was indeed true. Growing weary of their experiment, they started to release Vicar. As the triplet holding Vicar loosened his grip, he noticed blood on his hand and realized that one of his fingers was missing. Vicar then expelled the triplet's severed finger from his mouth. The triplet was shocked, demanding to know what Vicar had done. With a malevolent smile on his face, Vicar reminded the triplet of his earlier promise to consume his own hand. Meanwhile, the other 2 triplets attempted to defuse the escalating situation, suggesting they go to a priest to reattach the finger. However, Vicar was not interested in that solution. Instead, he proposed they simply allow them to leave. The injured triplet then attacked Vicar with a knife, calling him a bastard and reminding him that they were a year his senior. Vicar did not evade the attack, allowing the knife to press against him, but to the triplet's astonishment, it could not penetrate his skin. Vicar twisted the triplets' hand, reminding them that they had forgotten they were dealing with a Baskerville, where power and talent held sway over age. With a wicked look in his eyes, Vicar suggested they continue their game until the very end. Vicar twisted the triplets' hands without mercy, causing him to cry out in pain. He declared in a low, menacing voice that they were in Baskerville territory, where age was irrelevant as long as one possessed strength and talent. The triplets, utterly terrified, looked at each other in shock. Vicar suddenly punched the injured triplet, knocking him to the ground, while the other 2 watched in disbelief. The third triplet attacked Vicar in a surge of anger, but Vicar swiftly kicked him in the face, sending him crashing down. The room fell silent as the triplets lay there, battered and broken. Vicar stood over them, his expression cold and indifferent. He then informed the triplets that they would indeed recover with medical treatment, but he also made it clear that he would not permit them to leave the room, and they would be forced to live with the physical discomfort they had brought upon themselves. However, he would be generous and allow one of them to leave. The triplets were surprised and relieved to hear this and eagerly asked which one would be granted permission to depart. Vicar picked up the knife and tossed it onto the floor in front of the triplets, telling them that they would have to decide for themselves who would be allowed to exit the room. He then began to leave, but not before turning back and issuing a taunting remark, stating that he couldn't wait long, so they should decide quickly. He added pointedly, "At least one of you should live, right?" The triplets looked at the knife and then at one another, realizing that their survival was now their only objective. They commenced a violent struggle, each attempting to seize the knife and gain the upper hand over his brothers. The sounds of their fight echoed through the room, and Vicar listened from the outside with satisfaction. He had successfully engineered the fragmentation of Hugo's trident, instigating a conflict that pitted brother against brother in a fight for survival. In the Patriarch's office, the head butler, John Barrymore, delivered some disturbing news to the Baskerville clan patriarch, Hugo Le Baskerville. He reported that the Moore clan had been causing problems at the ruby mine, asserting it as their territory. However, Patriarch Hugo assured John that they would address the matter when the Moore clan made contact with them. John then provided an update on the interim evaluation of the juvenile fortress and informed the Patriarch that young Master Vicar had achieved the highest score on the written examination. The practical exam was scheduled to take place in 5 days, and the Guardian Knights had already vacated the premises in preparation. However, John hesitated before informing the Patriarch of a recent incident that had occurred at the juvenile fortress. John reported to the Patriarch that there had been a major fight among the young masters at the fortress. Patriarch Hugo expressed concern and inquired as to how many of them had died. Butler John confirmed to Hugo that there were no fatalities, but reported significant injuries. Master Hyo's dental structure had been entirely compromised, Master Mid-Leo's jaw had been fractured, and Master Lobo had suffered the amputation of his left index finger. Although their physical health had been restored through treatment, the psychological impact appeared substantial. Patriarch Hugo expressed surprise, stating that the triplets, being so close, wouldn't typically engage in conflict among themselves. John then disclosed that the friction involved another young master, an 8-year-old named Vicar, who had inflicted the wounds upon the trio and who had also achieved the highest results in the written assessment. Following Patriarch Hugo's expression of concern regarding the incident at the juvenile fortress, he commanded Vicar to come to his office. Vicar arrived displaying a pleasant demeanor, and Patriarch Hugo commented on his noticeable growth since their previous encounter. Patriarch Hugo then addressed the matter of Vicar incapacitating the 9-year-old triplets in the older class. Vicar stated that the siblings had received adequate medical attention subsequently. However, Patriarch Hugo clarified that his concern wasn't about physical incapacitation but the emotional harm inflicted. He elaborated on how the incident had fractured the brothers' relationship and questioned Vicar if he believed his actions were wrong. In response, Vicar posed a question of his own, asking what precisely he had done wrong. Patriarch Hugo pointed out that he had left his brothers in a state of complete disarray. Vicar, with a self-assured look in his deep crimson eyes, asserted his superior strength and questioned how the stronger party could be considered in the wrong. Patriarch Hugo then revealed that Vicar's siblings had forgiven him, yet Vicar still exhibited not the slightest trace of remorse. Vicar appeared momentarily taken aback by this information and inquired, "They forgave me?" Vicar's mind suddenly accessed a memory from before his regression. The youngest daughter of a noble house decimated by the Baskerville clan had visited Hugo. She had become a nun over the years and had offered forgiveness to Hugo, despite his family's responsibility for her own family's ruin. Vicar repeated the exact words Hugo had spoken to the nun, stating that forgiveness is an excuse devised by the weak who are unable to seek retribution due to their lack of capability. As Vicar spoke of the paramount importance of strength, Hugo signaled his approval with nods, his eyes gleaming in agreement. He then instructed the head butler, Barrymore, to permit Vicar to select any amount of snacks he could physically carry from the food stores. Vicar expressed his gratitude by specifically requesting chocolates. As Vicar was about to depart with the head butler, Hugo addressed him as his son, urging him to perform admirably in the forthcoming evaluation and to surpass the direct bloodline descendants. Vicar acknowledged the counsel, but his face was subtly contorted with animosity. Vicar and the head butler made their way to the storage chamber. The head butler began to provide information about the chocolate, explaining it was the finest quality, procured with great difficulty by the Moore clan, and was typically consumed by their elite. However, Vicar swiftly interrupted him, declaring he did not desire anything processed. The head butler was taken aback and requested clarification. Vicar then requested cacao beans, specifically those possessing a rich fragrance. The head butler was perplexed but complied, arranging for the beans to be brought to Vicar. As Vicar placed one of the beans in his mouth, the chef informed him they were known as bloody beans due to their potent aroma and that a single bean could yield enough essence for 100 liters of finished chocolate. The head butler observed Vicar consuming the bitter bean raw and mused that Vicar must possess a profound fondness for chocolate to eat something so unpalatable on its own, considering it a clever strategy to obtain a massive quantity of chocolate after processing. The chef inquired if Vicar wished for them to process the beans and deliver them to his chamber, but Vicar declined, stating he would take the bulk quantity as it was. The head butler was left to wonder if Vicar simply possessed peculiar culinary preferences. Vicar had no genuine interest in consuming the finished chocolate product, but he had a specific application in mind for the cacao beans. Vicar intended to utilize the beans during the upcoming practical assessment scheduled in 5 days. Unbeknownst to them, a calamitous event was soon to unfold, unlike anything previously experienced in the history of the Baskerville clan. In this realm, the Baskerville family is notoriously referred to as the Berserker family, a title earned due to the exceedingly rigorous training and evaluations their children endure from a very young age. This demanding regimen commences as soon as the children are capable of taking their initial steps. They are immediately subjected to an intense test of physical endurance. They are compelled to ascend a steep mountainous terrain and are prohibited from lying down or resting on their stomachs, except during specifically allocated periods. As if this were insufficient, when it is time for them to sleep, they are mandated to rest alongside a monstrous carcass. This practice is intended to acclimate them to harsh environments and cultivate resilience in the face of peril. These extreme methods are precisely what cultivate the Baskerville family's feared and respected reputation throughout the land. Following this period of arduous training, the children reach the age of 8, and the true examination commences. The young hounds, as they are designated, must undergo a potentially lethal evaluation. This trial is the defining moment that has cemented the Baskerville family's infamous reputation. Located on the periphery of their territory lies a mountain known as La Rouge-et-Lenoir Mountain. It is infested with monstrous creatures, and it is here that the young hounds assemble to undergo their assessment. The instructor responsible for the Baskerville family's training, Shadow Dog Paver van Baskerville, stood before the young masters and elucidated the rules of the test. They were required to survive for a duration of 1 month within the designated area and to hunt powerful and substantial monsters. He proceeded to explain the point system. Successful survival alone earned 10 points, surviving without sustaining disabling injuries was worth 30 points, surviving after causing the failure of other young masters yielded 50 points, defeating a monster and surviving awarded 70 points, and fulfilling all the aforementioned conditions would result in 90 points. Paver also informed the young masters that procuring the identification badge issued to another participant would grant additional points. However, he emphatically stated that death would result in 0 points. He stressed that a perfect score of 100 was unattainable, reminding them of Sir Hugo's principle that a swordsman perishes the moment they become arrogant. The instructor also warned against venturing outside the designated area, as La Rouge-et-Lenoir Mountain was a restricted zone containing numerous uncharted elements. He advised the young masters to confine their movements to the specified space where the monster population had already been somewhat controlled. He concluded by informing them that during the examination, shadow dogs would be concealed, observing and grading their performance. As the young masters awaited the commencement of the practical exam, some noticed Vicar and began conversing about his recent exploits. Despite their commentary, Vicar remained composed, his thoughts focused on La Rouge-et-Lenoir Mountain, a place he had visited in his previous life. Meanwhile, the triplets, standing near Vicar, were visibly agitated, beads of sweat forming from fear. Shadow Dog Paver addressed the assembled young masters, wishing them good fortune before the bell tolled, signaling the start of the assessment. The instant the bell rang, all the young masters immediately began running towards different sections of the mountain to secure advantageous positions. One of the young masters had formulated a plan and intended to proceed to a specific location he had observed during the previous year's examination, hoping to gain a strategic advantage. The young master following closely behind him decided he could not survive in isolation and resolved to shadow the first, with the intention of eventually taking whatever resources he gathered from him. Meanwhile, the trio of siblings were engaged in a disagreement, each insisting on his preferred method of action and vying for ultimate success. Shadow Dog Paver observed the commencement of the examination, cognizant of the imperative to minimize fatalities. Although lethal force was not explicitly forbidden, it was discouraged, and any participant who caused a death would incur point penalties. Paver and the other shadow dogs were committed to exerting their utmost effort to prevent any unnecessary loss of life. One of the shadow dogs assigned to monitor Vicar was taken aback by his course of action, as he was heading directly towards a prohibited zone. The shadow dog pondered Vicar's destination and questioned if this was indeed the rumored genius who had shown exceptional promise since early childhood. The shadow dog felt a surge of curiosity and eagerly anticipated witnessing the abilities Vicar would soon display. Vicar approached a substantial tree and considered whether this location was suitable. He reasoned that the soft ground would be ideal for establishing a temporary camp. Vicar then contemplated taking a period of rest, which utterly bewildered the shadow dog shadowing him. While other contestants were actively engaged in combat, either against each other for points or against formidable monsters, Vicar occupied himself by collecting firewood and practicing with a wooden rod. Later, he slept peacefully beneath the tree. The shadow dog, who had been observing Vicar, grew increasingly impatient and began to question the young boy's decisions. He wondered how long it had been since Vicar had taken any actual breaks and noted that most of his time was spent excavating holes, foraging for sustenance, or accumulating equipment. The shadow dog started to harbor doubts about the stories of Vicar's supposed genius, wondering if he was merely planning to remain concealed instead of participating actively in the examination. Ultimately, the shadow dog decided to depart and seek out more stimulating activities elsewhere. As soon as the shadow dog left, a smile illuminated Vicar's face. He was pleased to finally be able to relax and thought to himself that camping outdoors evoked memories of earlier times. Vicar recalled a past conversation with a member of his former group regarding the use of cacao beans to mitigate the fishy odor of seafood. He tossed some of the bloody beans into the fire and remarked that the bothersome shadow dog was finally gone, and his preparations were complete. He wondered aloud if this was the appropriate moment to commence his hunt. A few days later, Vicar ventured into the restricted territory and recognized it from his scouting missions in his previous life. As he traversed the area, he detected a scent of burning and noticed scorched tree roots. He knew that the dwelling place of the monster he sought was located somewhere nearby. Suddenly, he sighted burning excrement and realized he had found his target. There was only one creature in that vicinity that produced such droppings, a hellhound. The hellhound stood before Vicar, flames erupting from its maw. The hellhound was a creature originating from the infernal realms, known for bringing catastrophic misfortune to those who encountered it. It possessed a risk assessment rating of B+ and measured 3 meters in height. Its sulfuric flames, emanating from its mouth and eyes, were intensely gaseous and capable of igniting upon contact. If it managed to bite someone, survival was impossible. Living organisms used as fuel for its flames would burn relentlessly until completely consumed. Vicar recognized the peril he was in upon seeing the imposing form of the lookout monster that devoured the hellfires of the oil-soaked world, the hellhound. This beast was renowned as one of the most perilous monsters in the land, and Vicar had narrowly escaped an encounter with one in his past life when he was merely 18 years old. Now, as an 8-year-old, Vicar understood that defeating the hellhound alone would be an impossibility by conventional means. However, he recalled a method to confront the beast that even a child could execute. As the hellhound lunged towards him, Vicar swiftly evaded to the side. Recalling the hellhound's primary vulnerability, they were restricted to moving in straight trajectories, finding it exceedingly difficult to alter direction abruptly. Vicar quickly poured some water onto the ground, and as the hellhound charged towards him, he yelled out the second weakness of lookout monsters, their inability to traverse water. Because of the water Vicar had placed, the hellhound was forced to take a longer path to reach him, granting Vicar additional time to dodge. Vicar knew that even a shallow layer of water could significantly impede their movement, simultaneously exploiting a weakness common to all canine monsters, opening their mouths while running. Vicar found himself in another life-threatening scenario as the bloodthirsty hellhound attacked, but Vicar was prepared. He hurled a bloody bean directly into the monster's mouth. After landing, the hellhound suddenly began to whimper in agony and became immobilized. Vicar explained, even as the beast struggled, that chocolate was toxic to canines, and given the bloody bean's potency, capable of yielding 100 liters of chocolate essence from a single bean, its effect on a canine monster like the hellhound was predictable and devastating. He drew his sword and aimed for the hellhound's vulnerable spot, the area where the ribs were absent, the kidney. With a swift and decisive strike, Vicar pierced the hellhound's kidney, ending its life with ease. As he absorbed the energy, referred to as XP or karma, from the vanquished monster, Vicar felt his body strengthening. He swung his sword, noticing it felt lighter, a clear indication that he was rapidly recovering the power he possessed before his regression. He realized he was already catching up to the level he had attained before even reaching the age of 15 in his past life. Vicar couldn't help but anticipate the expression Hugo would display when he returned with a monster boasting a B+ risk rating as an 8-year-old child. Vicar stood there, ready to detach the head of the hellhound he had just defeated, brimming with confidence in his capabilities. He knew he had already secured the top position in the practical examination and was eager to claim the reward, something he could never have even imagined in his former life. However, his moment of triumph was brief, as a pack of hellhounds began to approach him, likely seeking retaliation for their fallen comrade. Vicar remained calm and collected, already familiar with the vulnerabilities of these creatures and the means to defeat them. As the hellhounds drew nearer, Vicar unsheathed his sword, preparing to engage them. He had an ample supply of bloody beans remaining and was ready to employ them to his advantage. With a smirk, he decapitated the deceased hellhound and taunted the approaching pack, secure in the knowledge that they were no match for his abilities and understanding. He had already overcome one of their kind and was prepared to face them all. The hellhound suddenly began to whimper, a reaction that immediately captured Vicar's attention. He couldn't fathom that such fierce beasts were experiencing fear in the presence of a mere 8-year-old's palpable bloodlust. Hellhounds would never cower before their prey, even in the face of death, Vicar thought to himself, desperately trying to comprehend what could have caused the hellhounds to feel such profound unease. As Vicar turned around, he beheld a monstrous entity standing before him with 3 heads. It was a Cerberus, the legendary 3-headed dog from ancient Greek mythology. The creature was enormous, measuring at least 7 meters in height, and Vicar immediately recognized it as a Cerberus, a creature known to possess a risk assessment rating of A+. Vicar was utterly perplexed as to why a Cerberus, which typically resided on the 7th ridge of La Rouge at Lenore Mountain, was present in this location. The Cerberus was infamous as the ultimate lookout monster, dwelling in a place where all departed spirits were destined. Vicar noticed that the Cerberus was injured, with several arrows lodged in its massive body. He realized that someone must have been hunting it, and it had fled all the way to this area while being pursued. This presented him with an unprecedented opportunity to confront and potentially eliminate a wounded A+ rank monster, and he resolved to attack the Cerberus. Despite the Cerberus being a powerful and dangerous creature, Vicar had been concealing his actual abilities as a sword expert, having already attained a high level of proficiency. His body had been significantly enhanced by the Styx River's properties, and the weapons he possessed were proving effective against the injured Cerberus. Employing his refined swordsmanship, which he had honed through conflicts with the demon clans, he successfully landed several blows on the Cerberus. Vicar thought to himself that this was achievable, as an injured Cerberus was a manageable opponent. Vicar's assault on the Cerberus seemed to be yielding results, and he believed he had a chance of defeating the wounded A+ rank monster. However, in a moment of inattention, Vicar lowered his guard, allowing the Cerberus to retaliate with its claws. The initial strike shattered Vicar's sword, and the subsequent blow sent him flying through the air. The force of the Cerberus's attack propelled Vicar towards a tree trunk, against which he struck with a sickening impact. Blood spilled from his mouth, and the collision had clearly inflicted a severe injury. Vicar lay motionless, his body broken and still. Vicar's eyes slowly opened, and a wave of panic washed over him as he recalled the direct assault from the Cerberus and felt an intense pain in his left arm. He feared that the beast had torn off his limb in the attack, but upon looking down, he saw that it was still connected to his body, albeit with significant injuries. Vicar felt a sense of relief that the Cerberus, being wounded itself, had not managed to completely sever his arm. He contemplated the Styx River and how its mystical attributes might have played a role in shielding him from the full force of the beast's attack. He knew he would not survive another direct strike from the Cerberus and thus dodged as the beast attacked him once more. As an experienced hunter, he understood that he had to identify the most favorable course of action in situations like this. The most advantageous decision at that moment was to retreat with all haste. As he ran, Vicar's mind raced with thoughts of survival. He knew he had to find a way out of this predicament, and quickly. His eyes scanned the surroundings, searching for an escape route. That's when he spotted it, an iron gate, just a few yards away. Vickers' heart surged with hope. He knew that if he could get past that gate, he would be outside the restricted area and nearer to safety. He pushed himself harder, running with all his might. With a surge of adrenaline, Vicker propelled himself through the gate, his heart pounding with relief. He had successfully exited the restricted zone, but he knew he was not yet out of danger. He had to reach the location, the sanctuary he had prepared for himself before embarking on this perilous mission. As he ran, he searched for something within the nearby woods, his heart pounding with the fear of being pursued by the hellhounds and the Cerberus. Finally, he located what he was looking for, a pit he had prepared in advance. He leaped forward, narrowly evading the snapping jaws of the pursuing Cerberus, and the massive three-headed dog plunged into the pit filled with sharpened wooden stakes. Vicker couldn't help but smile to himself, acknowledging that he had prepared meticulously for this confrontation. He had coated the wooden stakes with the essence of the bloody bean, which acted as a potent poison for canine monsters. The Cerberus snarled, and foam began to ooze from its mouths, but Vicker remained focused, preparing for the subsequent phase of the battle. He knew the Cerberus was a high-ranking demonic entity, and this fight would be one of the most challenging of his existence. Vicker prepared a wooden spear and hurled it at the Cerberus, striking the side of one of the hellhound heads. However, the Cerberus remained alive and continued advancing towards him, ready to attack. Vicker meticulously counted the hellhound's steps as it approached him, one by one. As soon as the Cerberus completed its seventh step, it stopped abruptly, collapsing to the ground directly in front of Vicker. Vicker exhaled in relief, realizing that the rumors were true. The wooden spear he had just thrown was unlike the others. It was a spear laced with the venomous fang of the lethal bloody mamba snake, a poison that prevented its victim from moving more than 7 steps after being bitten. Vicker had concealed this weapon when he was younger, knowing it could be useful one day. The energy emanating from the Cerberus's body flowed into Vicker as he stood over the 3 lifeless heads of the beast. He marveled at the power he now possessed, but his thoughts quickly shifted to the logistical challenge of transporting the enormous body back. He knew that the manner of the Cerberus's demise would be obvious to anyone who saw it, and he began to consider who might serve as a witness to validate his feat. Perhaps the guardian knight who had observed him carving the wooden spears could be of assistance. But then Vicker's mind turned to something entirely different. The Cerberus was a gatekeeper, which implied it was guarding something, most likely a dungeon located nearby. Vicker's heart quickened at the prospect of the treasure that might be hidden within. He knew that dungeons were often the lairs of powerful monsters. Vicker was determined to explore the dungeon, but before entering, he took a handful of Cerberus feces and smeared it onto his body. Vicker knew that this action would deter any smaller monsters that might be lurking along his path. Vicker's acute senses were fully engaged as he tracked the Cerberus's trail through the forest. He noted the dry soil, the decaying leaves, and the damp roots, following the path with singular focus. As he backtracked, his eyes widened in recognition. This was the dungeon that the Cerberus had been guarding, and Vicker realized he had been here before in his past life. He knew that this dungeon would eventually be discovered in another 10 years, but he was certain it would be completely devoid of anything by then. However, at this moment, he could sense the flow of mana beneath the surface. Vicker approached the dungeon cautiously. He looked around but saw no light, leading him to believe the dungeon extended deeper than he initially thought. But Vicker was undaunted. His crimson eyes gleamed with anticipation as he stepped inside the dungeon. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of riches awaited him within. As Vicker made his way through the dark dungeon, he observed ruby minerals scattered throughout the area. He was certain these veins must be connected to the nearby Red All Mountain. Suddenly, he caught a glimmer of light emanating from within the dungeon, and he couldn't help but wonder if it was the entrance he had been searching for. Eager to explore further, he accelerated his pace and soon found himself standing in a brightly illuminated chamber. As his eyes adjusted to the light, he was struck by the sight of a colossal ruby placed on a pillar in the center of the room. He couldn't help but marvel at the gemstone's beauty and realized it must be infused with mana to produce such a brilliant glow. However, his moment of awe was interrupted when he spotted a nearby skeleton lying on the ground. As he approached, he noticed signs of violence, including deep stab wounds and dried brown bloodstains. He realized someone had been here before him, and a considerable amount of time had passed since their untimely demise. Curious, Vicar picked up a letter resting beside the skeletal remains. The writer of the letter began by introducing himself as Cain and explaining he did not wish to defile the pristine paper with his name. As Vicar continued reading, he recognized the handwriting as belonging to a Baskerville and wondered if the author was a member of that family line. The letter went on to recount how Cain and his brother Abel had stumbled upon the legendary stone chamber that had been spoken of within the family for generations. The two brothers had successfully navigated countless trials and slain many monsters in their quest to reach the chamber. However, the final task they encountered within had confined them there for 3 long years. Vicar could scarcely believe the sacrifice they had made for the potential treasure within the dungeon. He wondered what kind of treasure could possibly warrant such a sacrifice. His attention was drawn back to the present as he gazed upon the magnificent ruby at the chamber's center, realizing it must be the key to unlocking the dungeon's final assignment. Vicar read the enigmatic inscription on the monument aloud. When entering, it's 1, but once inside, it's 2, when leaving, it's 1. He found himself unable to comprehend its meaning but recalled reading in the letter that Cain and Abel had also struggled with it. According to the letter, the two brothers had pondered over the ominous text for an extended period before arriving at a conclusion. Cain had written that he and Abel were twins who had been separated at birth. In order to obtain the dungeon's treasure, they believed they needed to become one again. This, they concluded, meant only one of them could depart with the treasure. Cain had tragically ended up killing his own brother in a fierce conflict, but despite this, there was no change. They had undoubtedly transitioned from 2 to 1, yet Cain could not claim the treasure. After moments of regret, Cain had resolved to leave the place and warn others not to venture there. He had written in the letter that there was nothing to be gained from this devil's den, which only served to taunt humans. Vicar read the letter carefully as Cain recounted their journey to the dungeon. They had faced innumerable challenges to reach this point, but now they were left with nothing. Vicar couldn't help but think about the task he had been assigned and the fact that it mirrored Cain and Abel's, despite his lack of a twin sibling. He knew that Cain and Abel had misinterpreted the text, but what was the true meaning of when entering, it's 1, but once inside, it's 2, when leaving, it's 1? The words echoed in his mind as he strained to decipher their significance. Vicar refused to yield. He was resolute in his conviction that no labyrinth was insurmountable and was determined to unravel this enigma.